Okay, so let's dive in. We're tackling a pretty complex situation today, really centered on downtown Los Angeles and the recent tensions that flared up there.
Yeah, it seems like it was all kicked off by those ICE enforcement actions we've been hearing about.
Exactly. And we have a really detailed source here. Looks like an article that gives us well, a thorough account of the events, the reactions, and what actually unfolded on the ground.
Right. Seems quite comprehensive.
So our mission for this deep dive is essentially to guide you through the core story laid out in this article. We want to pull out the key events, try to understand the different perspectives it presents, and grasp the wider implications discussed.
So you can get a handle on this challenging moment quickly.
Precisely. All right, let's start at the beginning then. What did this source actually identify as the main trigger for the protests?
Well, the article really pinpoints a series of pretty aggressive ICE enforcement raids.
Aggressive how?
Well, they weren't just scattered randomly. The source says they specifically targeted neighborhoods across LA known for having high immigrant populations. That action, that's identified as the immediate catalyst.
Okay. And the reaction sounds like it was pretty swift.
Oh, yeah. Immediate. The text describes this wave of outrage. You had community leaders, activists, residents. They organized protests really quickly, but it wasn't just about the detentions themselves, though obviously that was central.
The article highlights something deeper then, a broader reason.
Absolutely. It frames the protests more as a wider condemnation of policies that people saw as unjust, as punitive even.
Right.
What the source seems to emphasize is this demand for more humane immigration reform. It connects that strict enforcement directly to the impact on families, on community stability.
And this wasn't just a small gathering that fizzled out.
No, not at all. The article notes these protests grew quite significantly, actually, in both size and intensity. And it drew participants from really diverse backgrounds, which suggests this became a much wider challenge. Not just to the ICE tactics, but to the underlying U.S. immigration laws themselves. It shows this kind of building wave of public dissent.
Okay, so the protests started, people were making their voices heard, but then the situation, it escalated. How did the atmosphere shift, according to the article?
Yeah, the source details a pretty definite turn. It started, peaceful gatherings, but it moved towards more confrontational encounters. Seems like this happened as the protests went on and, like we said, grew larger.
Was there a specific place where things really ramped up?
Yes, the article mentions a specific flashpoint near the Metropolitan Detention Center. Apparently, a large group had gathered right there, and that's where the source describes the tension really boiling over.
Okay. And what actions did the protesters take that led to this escalation? What did the source say?
Well, the text indicates that some individuals, within the crowd began throwing objects towards the police lines.
Objects like what?
Bottles and other projectiles were specifically mentioned in the article, and that really marked a shift in tactics, at least by some demonstrators.
And how did law enforcement respond at that point? Because that's a different situation.
Right, and this is where the response escalated, too. Law enforcement deployed tear gas and flashbangs, trying to disperse the crowd.
Wow.
The article points to this as a really key moment in that dynamic, that back and forth between the police and protesters.
And following that, there was an official declaration, wasn't there?
That's right. Law enforcement then declared an unlawful assembly.
Okay.
And the source explains this decision was cited by them for maintaining public safety, amidst what they saw as disruptive behaviors. It definitely underscored the gravity of the situation from their perspective.
Did the article mention any other reactions to that specific law enforcement response? The tear gas, the declaration?
It did, yes. It notes that community leaders and human rights organizations voiced concerns. They were worried about the level of force used, particularly the tear gas and flashbangs, and what they saw as the implications for civil liberties.
So clearly different viewpoints on that response.
Yeah, it highlights a real division in how these events were being interpreted on the ground.
Okay, let's shift focus just slightly. What did the source tell us about how the LAPD specifically managed the situation over the entire weekend, not just that one flashpoint?
The article details that the LAPD, they significantly mobilized their resources. Their main focus, it says, was on maintaining public order and safety. And they used various crowd control strategies to do that.
Like managing traffic, setting up barriers, that sort of thing.
Exactly. The text mentions things like detouring traffic. Yeah, and forming barricades to kind of control the flow of people. And they deployed a substantial number of officers to the area.
And the source suggests they had sort of a dual objective here.
Yes, that's how the article describes it. Their presence served two purposes. One, deterring illegal activities, but also attempting to allow for peaceful expressions of dissent.
So trying to find that balance.
Trying to strike that balance, yeah, in what was clearly a very difficult environment.
Were there any further preparations mentioned in the article
Yeah.
beyond the immediate police presence?
Yes. A notable point the source includes is that the National Guard was actually placed on standby.
The National Guard. Wow.
Yeah, as a precautionary measure, which, indicates the level of concern authorities had about potential further escalation.
Did law enforcement try to engage with the protest organizers at all, according to the source? Was there communication?
The article states that law enforcement did maintain communication lines with protest leaders. It seems the aim was to maybe facilitate a smoother process where possible,
Right.
while importantly still reserving and asserting their authority to declare that unlawful assembly if they felt it was necessary.
Okay, now here's where the situation seems to take another really significant turn. According to the source, the involvement of the federal government. What did that actually entail?
Yeah, this is a really key development outlined in the article. It reports that the federal government decided to deploy military personnel to downtown LA.
Military personnel, like who?
It specifically mentions Marines and National Guard troops, federalized National Guard presumably alongside Marines.
Okay, Marines and federal troops. What was the stated reason for bringing them in?
The rationale, as presented in the article, was for enhanced security and maintaining order. It was framed as an effort to deter potential violence and help mitigate any chaotic situations that had developed or might develop.
But the article also made a really crucial distinction about their role, didn't it? They weren't acting as, like, local police officers.
Precisely. The source is very clear on this. Their role was strictly limited to support functions. They were positioned as backup for the local police departments, explicitly not as frontline law enforcement agents.
And there's a specific legal reason behind that limitation, right?
Yes, the article references the Posse Comitatus Act, which, is a fundamental U.S. federal law.
Right, that limits military involvement in civilian law enforcement.
Exactly. It generally restricts the use of federal military personnel like the Army or Air Force, and interpreted to cover Marines in this context in domestic civilian law enforcement roles.
Meaning they couldn't just step in and start, say, making arrests.
That's largely correct. The
Mhm.
act broadly prohibits them from making arrests or exercising typical police powers unless there's a very specific legal exception, usually authorized by Congress or the Constitution in extreme circumstances.
Which wasn't described as their mission here.
No, their role here, according to the source, was support. It's all about maintaining that traditional separation between the military and civilian law enforcement authority in the U.S. This detail in the source is particularly revealing about the legal framework surrounding this federal action.
So you have federal military personnel in L.A. How did the local leaders in California react to this, according to the article?
Well, the source highlights some pretty strong reactions, particularly from key figures like Governor Gavin Newsom and the mayor of Los Angeles, Karen Bass.
And they were critical.
Yes, both were described as being critical of this federal intervention involving military personnel.
Okay, what were Governor Newsom's main points, as reported?
Governor Newsom, according to the article, really emphasized a belief that immigration enforcement should prioritize compassion and human rights over what he saw as aggressive, militarized approaches. He viewed the federal action as potentially stepping on state autonomy, and he reiterated his commitment, the state's commitment, to protecting immigrant rights through California's own laws.
And Mayor Bass, what was her take?
Mayor Bass seemed to echo a lot of those concerns. The article says she insisted that the local community shouldn't have to bear the negative impacts of federal actions that, in her view, were creating fear and division.
Right.
She called for a more collaborative approach, one that actually includes local input and protects residents' rights.
Did she also comment specifically on the police declaring unlawful assembly earlier?
Yes, the article notes that Mayor Bass pointed to those unlawful assembly designations. She saw them as reflecting a kind of troubling trend, potentially towards over-policing, especially in marginalized communities.
Interesting perspective.
Yeah, she argued for focusing more on dialogue and de-escalation rather than confrontation.
So the source really presented a picture of a pretty unified opposition from these two prominent local leaders against those federal actions.
Definitely. The article summarizes their positions as being against federal policies they felt undermined immigrant protections. And they were both pushing for a more humane localized approach.
What the source really highlights there is that clear tension, isn't it, between the state and federal levels reacting to the same set of events.
Exactly. That friction is palpable in the description.
And it sounds like the impact of these events in LA stretched beyond the city limits.
Yeah.
What did the article say about the wider national implications?
Yeah, what's fascinating here is how quickly, according to the source, the protests described in LA seem to resonate elsewhere.
Oh, really?
The article states that similar demonstrations were sparked in other major cities across the U.S. It specifically mentions places like New York, Chicago, San Francisco.
And these were direct reactions.
Explicitly described that way in the source, yes, as reactions to the aggressive enforcement tactics people were seeing or hearing about from LA.
So it tapped into some kind of broader feeling across the country.
Yes, the source characterizes this as contributing to maybe a growing national sentiment of dissent against federal actions that were perceived as draconian. It was like a public reaction spreading geographically.
And this whole situation, according to the article, is feeding into bigger conversations nationally.
Absolutely. The protests are presented in the article as making a significant contribution to these broader national discussions about, immigration reform, about law enforcement practices, and about fundamental civil rights, especially in the context of immigration.
And did the source mention how the issue of immigration itself is being framed or reframed by these events?
Yes, that's a key point. The article notes a significant narrative shift, particularly among organizers and activists.
How so?
They're increasingly viewing immigration not just through the lens of, say, law enforcement or border security, but really framing it as a critical civil rights issue.
Right.
And doing that, the source suggests, brings more attention to questions of systemic racism and injustice that they see within the current immigration system.
Okay, so bringing it back to the present, or at least the time the article was written,
Mm-hmm.
where do things stand now, and what did the article suggest about the future for these protests and any potential legal challenges?
Well, the article indicates that the protests are, ongoing. The dissent against the aggressive enforcement and what people see as infringements on immigrant rights, that remains active.
And with ongoing protests, is the potential for more arrests still high?
The source suggests, yes, there is a high likelihood of further arrests. This is framed pretty much as a consequence of law enforcement's ongoing task to maintain public order and how they respond to acts of civil disobedience.
Right. Are there legal battles happening in the courts based on all this?
Yes, the article mentions that these events are tangled up with some multifaceted legal challenges. It notes that advocacy groups are actively challenging federal authority through lawsuits.
On what grounds?
Arguing, according to the source, that some of these federal actions undermine local laws and the fundamental rights of residents.
And what's the potential impact of those legal cases? What could happen?
Well, the source points out that the outcomes could be quite significant. Court rulings could potentially either, embolden activists and maybe lead to changes in enforcement tactics.
Or the opposite.
Or they could result in stricter restrictions on future demonstrations and civil disobedience. It could go either way.
That raises an important challenge, doesn't it? Which the article highlights for the organizers themselves.
It does.
Which is?
The source notes that organizers are basically navigating this really precarious balance. On one hand, trying to effectively advocate for immigrants and their rights, but on the other hand, having to seriously consider the potential consequences, like those unlawful assembly designations and the real risk of arrests for participants.
Yeah, that's a tough tightrope to walk.
It's described as a very complex strategic challenge for them.
So summing up this deep dive into the source material, we've walked through how, according to this article, aggressive ICE raids sparked these escalating tensions and protests in downtown LA, which led to police declaring unlawful assembly.
Right, and the article makes it clear this wasn't just some isolated incident in LA. It connected to a much broader national conversation about immigration enforcement versus civil rights.
And it really highlighted that friction we talked about between federal and state authority in managing these kinds of situations.
Exactly. The source guided us through those initial triggers, the shift towards confrontation, including those specific flashpoints, and the law enforcement responses like tear gas, then the LAPD's strategic actions over the weekend.
And that particularly notable detail of federal military personnel being deployed, but with those specific legal limits under posse comitatus.
Yeah, that was key. And we heard how local leaders like Governor Newsom and Mayor Bass reacted strongly against that federal approach, advocating for something more humane, more locally informed.
And the article showed how these events resonated nationally, didn't it? Sparking similar protests elsewhere and helping to frame immigration increasingly as a civil rights issue.
And the path ahead, according to the article, seems to involve continued protest, but also these significant legal battles that could really shape future dynamics, leaving organizers, as we said, with those challenging strategic decisions.
The source concludes by suggesting these events kind of echo a longer history of resistance against governmental authority. And maybe, just maybe, they signal a need to re-examine that fundamental relationship between citizens and state power in the U.S.
That's a powerful thought.
It is. So the question the article leaves us with, and maybe leaves you with, is what is this ongoing tension, this push and pull between federal enforcement, local autonomy, civil liberties, immigrant rights? What does it all mean for the very fabric of society in the United States going forward? That's a pretty profound question to sit with, based on what this source suggests.